going to be continuing on this evening in Matthew chapter 24. We're going to start in verse 14. And read through verse 31. Had a glitch in my Bible that didn't want to go away. Beginning in verse 14, it says, "And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whosoever readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye your flight be not in winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time. No, nor shall ever shall be." Excuse me. "And except those days should be shortened, there should be no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days shall be shortened. Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here's Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible they shall deceive the very elect. Behold, I've told you before. Wherefore if they shall say unto you, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with great sound of trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now learn the parable of the fig tree." Well, we looked at that this morning, so we'll stop there. Now, this morning I skipped these verses, and tonight we're going to concentrate on them a little more directly as to how they concern us and our time. Many view these as being fulfilled with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. I can even see how the abomination of desolation could be viewed as the Roman army who destroyed the temple and raped the Temple Mount. But it still leaves a dilemma in verse 21 that says, "Then shall begin great tribulation." So let's look at it together. To begin with, we started there in verse 14. It says, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. I guess before I get too far into this, I want to go ahead and point something out that most of you know, and I've said it many times. Matthew's a Jew. He's a Hebrew. And a lot of times when Hebrews write something, they'll write a little, and then they'll come back and write a little more about the same thing, and they'll come back and they'll write a little more about the same thing. We find at least some of that in these verses as we continue into them. But in verse 14, Jesus said the gospel would be preached in all the world for a witness to the nations. And I want to emphasize the emphasis should be on all nations, not all individuals. And then the end will come. The gospel of the kingdom has circled the globe, and as we mentioned this morning, has been rather ill received. People just are rejecting it. However, it has circled the globe, and so the world is ripe for the end. He says it has to be a witness to all nations, and then the end. So we are ripe for the end. As we look at it, we find this portion of prophecy, this portion of prophecy has been fulfilled, but it looks very much like what we find in the book of Revelation. In Revelation chapter 14, verse 15, it says, "And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, Thrust in thy sickle and reap, for the time is come for thee to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." Now, to be honest about it, in looking at this in context, this reaping that we read in Revelation 14:15 is the rapture. It is when all of the saved who are, all of the saved, period, will be caught up into the clouds and meet the Lord in the air. Whether we be alive or whether we've been in the feeding worms. Either way, when Jesus returns in the cloud and calls us up, we were all going to go. All of the saved, from every generation. But at any rate, as we look at this first part, this first reaping is the rapture. But immediately following that, there is another verse. The next verses, there's a reaping in preparation for the final 7 vials filled with the wrath of God and Armageddon. I want to read those to you as well. Revelation chapter 14, verse 17, beginning in verse 17. And another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle, and another angel came out from the altar, which had power over fire, and cried with a loud voice, loud cry to him that had the sharp sickle, saying, "Thrust in thy sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are full ripe." And the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth, and gathered the vine of the earth, and cast it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden without the city, and blood came out of the winepress, even unto the horses' bridles, by the space of 1,600 furlongs. Now, in looking at this, we find a description, and I want to point out there's not a better outline of the book of Revelation than Matthew chapter 24, because it just the two just kind of fold together like this. But at any rate, in the next verses that we read, it says, "Now the abomination of desolation," where we read, it says, "When you shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whosoever readeth, let him understand." The abomination of desolation that is spoken of by Daniel has not yet been revealed. Many erroneously think that this is a reference to Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. It is not. This abomination of desolation has not yet been revealed. He will not be revealed until we're raptured. He's going to be working in the world. He's going to have control over the world. And we're going to know who he is, but the world won't. It is when we're gone that the world really realizes who the Antichrist is. And then they say, oh me, it's too late. Daniel 9, as I said, Daniel 9:27 is thought to be a reference to the Antichrist, assuming the he of verse 27 is referring to the prince that shall come in verse 26. In Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, it says, and the people of the prince shall come, that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end of the war, desolations are determined. However, if you will, and I know I'm flipping to verses too quick for you to keep up with me, but mark these, and when you get home, look at it and see that what I'm telling you is absolute fact. Daniel chapter 9 and verse 26 speaks of a prince, but the problem is the prince is an object of a preposition modifying people. An object of a preposition cannot be a subject. The subject of verse 26 is Messiah. Back up one more verse, verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, the street shall be built again and the wall even in troublous times. The subject from chapter 9, verse 24, all the way through the rest of the chapter. The subject is Messiah. Messiah is coming. This is how long it will be. With that in mind, we have to understand then that the he of verse 27 is the subject of verse 26, which is Messiah. He shall confirm the covenant with many for a week. This is a whole other sermon, and I don't want to preach it. I just wanted to point out that the subject of the whole chapter, Daniel chapter 9, is Messiah. Not the Antichrist, Messiah. With that in mind, we must look elsewhere in Daniel for this reference to the abomination of desolation, or the detestable thing that makes desolate. Well, he's mentioned in chapter 7 and verse 20, but there's very little detail. Daniel chapter 7 verse 20 says, and of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom the 3 fell, even of that horn that had eyes and a mouth that spake great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. He's better described in chapter 11. I'll wait and let you get there. Daniel chapter 11. Antichrist is not in chapter 9. Antichrist is in chapter 7. Actually in another reference further back, but he's also in chapter 11. Best details we get of him is in chapter 11. In Daniel chapter 11, in chapter 11, verses 36 through 45. But rather than read all of that, I will reference just two verses, verse 36 and verse 45. In verse 36 it says, "And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done." And then in verse 45, "He shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him." Now, the first 35 verses of Daniel chapter 11 is fulfilled by Alexander the Great, his 4 generals, and the two main ones in the picture are the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in the region of Syria, Babylon. And by the way, I want to correct myself. Well, let me go ahead and say this first, and then I'll come back and correct myself. The Seleucids produced the Antiochuses, the most notable of them being Epiphanes, one who slew a swine in the tabernacle, or the temple, not the tabernacle. Wednesday night I said that the Antiochuses came from the Assyrian Empire. They didn't. They came from the Seleucid Empire. But it is in the region of Assyria that they're named. So at any rate, as we see this, back to our text, it says this. This abomination of desolation is going to stand on the Temple Mount and declare himself God. It is yet to come, and we're going to look at that as we're going to see when it comes as we read on. But the first thing that we want to recognize is in our text, back in our text starting in verse 16, he says, "Then let them which are in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in winter, neither on the Sabbath day." This seems to coincide with Revelation chapter 12 and verse 6, when Israel is driven into the wilderness for 3.5 years, or 1,260 days. Not all of you have heard this, but some of you have heard this and probably forgot it 4 times over. I have at one time preached through Revelation to you. And when I did, I pointed out something. And the thing that I pointed out was that I see it as consecutive events, not concurrent. Some people think it's concurrent. In other words, the first seal, first angel, first trumpet, first. I see it as consecutive. They go through the seals, and then into the trumpets, and into the. But starting in chapter 12, from chapter 12 through 16 or 17. Anyway, 3 or 4 or 5 chapters is parenthetical, and it starts with the history. It starts with Israel and gives the history of the world all the way to the end, and then it goes back and picks up the narration again. But and go read that and see if it isn't so. Give you something to study. Chapters 12, 13, 14, and 15, I know, are parenthetical. It starts with the woman clothed with her stone, with the stars and the moon and so forth, the 12 stars. It's describing the nation of Israel. And then in verse 6, it tells us that the dragon cast out a flood against Israel. And in verse 6 it says, the woman fled into the wilderness where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days, 1,260 days. This seems to be what's being said here. When you see the abomination of desolation stand on the Temple Mount. I've been telling everybody that'll listen to me for a long time, I think we're close, and the thing you need to be watching is Israel. Because the next big thing is when the Antichrist forces, whomever they are, I think they're Islam, led by Syria, will invade Israel and drive them out. But it's setting up for that now, if you've been watching the news. Next big thing to happen is going to happen in Israel. But at any rate, let's get back to what we're talking about. The woman fled into the wilderness where she has had a place prepared to God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. That's 1,260 days, or 3.5 years. Now, looking back at Daniel chapter 9, it is assumed that the Antichrist and his armies will be Roman, because it was Romans who destroyed the temple and razed the city. People of the prince that should come. People of the prince that should come. Matthew 24. People have looked at the Vatican for years. Not so much anymore, but when I was first started preaching, everybody was looking at Rome, the Pope. Pope ain't got no power now, much less then. The people of the prince that shall come may simply be just Gentiles. Not necessarily Romans, just Gentiles. Anybody that's not a Jew is a Gentile. Because it's looking very much like the Antichrist and his armies are going to be Muslim. They're overrunning the world. If they are who I think they are, can we stop them? No. It's in God's plan. I say possibly Syrian-led because, well, Syria occupies the space where the Seleucid kings reign. And some of them, even though they've changed their religion, which, by the way, Daniel said they would, they occupy the space the Seleucids reigned from. When they invade Israel and drive them out into the wilderness, mentioned in Revelation chapter 12, it will be a mad dash. When they overrun Israel, it's going to happen so quickly. You know, everybody was in awe over the 6-day war when Israel gained all that territory in 6 days. It's going to be faster than that. It's going to be faster than that because it says, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. It's going to be, get out of here or die. Which, what we gather from Revelation, and I try not to put too much material in here, but from Revelation, you know, there's only a third of them that's going to survive. Now, for many years, scholars thought that the place that they would flee to will be Petra. It may be, but I'm skeptical. The main reason I'm skeptical is Petra's in Jordan. On the other hand, I've mentioned this before, Israel has an underground military installation in the Negev desert which belongs to Israel that will accommodate the population of Israel, the population that is to be spared. And it's practically impenetrable. He speaks of hardships of raising children in that time, and how the harshness of the situation could be heightened by the cold of winter. Now, I'll mention this again. Some think this was all fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. I think that interpretation ignores too many details. I mean, there's just too many other things involved for it to have been fulfilled then. When Israel is driven out into her hiding place, the final 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week will have begun. Daniel 9:27. He shall confirm the covenant with many for a week. In the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate even unto the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Again, those who think this is the Antichrist say that Israel will make the Antichrist will make a false peace with Israel that lasts 3.5 years. And then he will turn on them and be driven out, and there'll be the final 3.5 weeks. Again, Daniel 9:27 is not talking about the Antichrist. It's talking about Messiah. Messiah's ministry, earthly ministry, was just shy of 3.5 years. And while there may be a false peace between Antichrist and his armies in Israel, if there is, it won't be more than 75 days. Because that's how much short of 3.5 years the Lord's ministry was. I know for an absolute bona fide fact that after they're driven out into the wilderness, that's the beginning of the last half, or 33 and a half, last 3.5 years. You know, that's not guesswork. That's just fact. So, in verse 23 of our text, it says, "Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here's Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect." Y'all have heard me preach this before, and I'm still uncomfortable because I know people don't want to think about the possibility that we might go through this. But then again, saints in the Dark Ages didn't want to think about being blocked off in a cave and hot boiling oil poured down on them. But it happened. As I mentioned this morning, and I'll mention it again because this is our consolation. While we will be hated by the world, we are loved by our Savior. And though we will be facing persecution from the world, we will be, if there's an if in that, if we remain true to the Word, we will be protected from the plagues that come on the world. Don't have it in my outline, and I don't want to make this any longer than it already is, or I would take you to Revelation and show you where that's said. But there's the 144,000 of Israel sealed, and then after that there's a multitude of every kindred and tongue. If any man say unto you, Lo, here's Christ, or there, believe it not. There shall arise false Christs, false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they would deceive the very elect. Apparently during this period of great tribulation, there are going to be false Christs and false prophets working genuine miracles. Now, if someone came around right now and claimed to work a miracle, how would you react? Smoke and mirrors. But if someone came around and worked a genuine miracle and all this other stuff is happening all around us, how would you react? It would make you wonder. But it's not possible for them to fool us. Because, you know why? Verse 25. Behold, I've told you before. If if Jesus says it, how sure is it? If they say unto you, behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret places, believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. You know, I can't read all these verses that explains it and without just trying to get you to imagine in your mind. You seen a bolt of lightning? That's how fast the rapture is. Now there's all kinds of stuff that's described here. In fact, it says the whole world's going to see it. But it's just, boom, it's done. Paul writes 4 or 5 verses in 1 Corinthians and 4 or 5 verses in 1 Thessalonians, and you know, and you can't begin to read all of those in you know, and all of that's happening like that. My popper quit. When I had that little stroke, my popper just, hey, it worked. You've seen a miracle. The thing that keeps them from being able to deceive the elect is Jesus told us before. This is what's going to happen. It's so sudden, it's like lightning flashing across the sky. Paul said, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump, for the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. How does everybody come out of the grave? Breath come into them, or life, and them caught up in the air, and us caught up in the air to meet them together. How does all that happen in and where's it going to be? In the air. Verse 28, for wheresoever the carcass is. Now, I would say carcass, but I'm still planning on being one of those that gets out alive. I'm not in the dying crowd, I'm in the flying crowd. But if not, if I die, if I'm buried, this carcass, even after it's completely rotted away, is going to come back together and be lifted up from the grave and life restored to me. That quick. It's going to be in the air, where the eagles fly. In Acts chapter 1, verses 10 and 11, while they looked steadfastly toward heaven as he went up, behold, 2 men stood by them in white apparel, which also said, Ye men of Galilee, why stand ye and gaze up into heaven? This same Jesus, which is taken from you into heaven, shall come in like manner as you have seen him go. And then our text, back to verse 29 of our text, it says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light. Here's this Hebrewism. We've gone back to a brief reference to Revelation chapter 6 when he opened the 6th seal. The sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. Can I repeat that? Then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Folks, the whole world is going to see this. Brother Mike mentioned in Sunday school this morning how that the soldiers knelt and mocked Jesus, but there's a day coming when they're going to get on their knees and they're truly going to say, "Thou art God." Problem is, it's too late. And that's what we have here. The earth is going to mourn because they're going to see Jesus step out and call us up. You know, there's all kinds of theories about, oh, what are people going to do? How are they going to explain everybody missing and all? Hey, they're going to know. And for the next 45 days, they're going to wish they had died. How do I know it's 45 days? Well, Daniel chapter 12 tells us the time period from the resurrection and rapture until the end of the vials. And if you just do the math, it's 45 days. The most horrible 45 days that this earth has ever seen. Because in those 45 days, God is mad. The last 7 vials are described as being filled up with the wrath of God. There's no better way today to explain that than to simply say, God is mad. We're wrestling fans. There was all kinds of shock apparently last night when Brock Lesnar showed up. And you know, Brock Lesnar's going to get on his knees and say, "Man, I ain't never seen nothing like this." There's no way for us to describe it. Read Revelation, the last 7 vials. Just read those. And try and imagine those things happening. And this is after the earth has already gone through all these other plagues. And God wasn't even mad then. Well, anyway, he shall send his angel with a great sound of the trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the earth to the other. I want you to take note of the trumpet. As I said this morning, I used to make fun of people who talked about the plain truth of the last trump. So now it's my turn to be laughed at because the rapture occurs, Paul said, at the last trump. The rapture occurs with the sound of the trumpet. 1 Thessalonians 4:16 talks about the blowing of the trumpet. 1 Corinthians 15:52 speaks of the last trump, for the trumpet shall sound. In Revelation 11:15, the seventh angel sounded, and there were great voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ, and he shall reign forever. That is the last trumpet in the last book of the Bible. I'm not going to offer an invitation, but I am in a sense. I'm not going to offer a formal invitation, but rather a personal invitation. A lost person. Jesus invites you here and now to be saved and become a part of his family. Being a part of his family protects you. Not only does it offer you eternal life, but it protects you from these things. If you see this thing we call the rapture and are not saved, all hope is gone. You know, there are people that want to talk about, you know, people being one after the rapture. What was that series of books? Tribulation. Left Behind. Yeah. Wonderful series, good reading. I mean, it's got to be good reading for me to read it. I don't read anything but the Bible. But it's a bunch of baloney. Once we're caught out, it's over. Brethren, got a better message for you. Be comforted in these words. We may see some terrible times, but it only means redemption is drawing nigh. As long as we remain true to God's word, the world is going to hate us, and the world is going to persecute us, and the world is going to try and kill us. But we're protected from the plagues that